Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you a project I've been working on, which is a hack for the game Hunter on the Commodore Amiga. I wouldn't call this the definitive version yet, and I still have a lot of ideas for this hack that I would like to try out and implement, but I would say this project is finished enough to call this the first release and share it with the rest of the world. I'll probably make another follow-up video as I make more improvements. If you haven't played the original game or didn't get very far in it, let me first tell you what the game is about. Hunter was released by Activision in 1991 for the Amiga and the Atari ST and was developed by Paul Holmes. It's a 3D action-adventure game in which you control a soldier that can roam around a huge map consisting of various islands. Your character can be navigated around simply by walking, but you can also board and control vehicles like bicycles, boats, hovercraft, helicopters and many more. There are buildings scattered around the world which you can enter, most of which can be entered freely, but some require a special uniform, key or pass to gain access. Inside these buildings you'll usually find items to pick up or people to interact with. The player carries various weapons and these need to be loaded with ammo before use. Ammo can be bought in stores or picked up throughout the world. Each type of weapon has its own characteristics and uses. Bullets are good for short range and destroying small objects or killing enemy soldiers. But, for example, there's also a bazooka for long range attacks and timed explosives for taking out specific targets. Not only can the player you control attack enemies and destroy objects, there are also enemy soldiers, vehicles and weapons that target you and try to kill you. These are the main mechanics of the game, and you can't just mindlessly go around and explore and blow up stuff. However, the game does give you goals to complete in the form of missions, and these missions are spread over 3 game modes. There's the Hunter mode, where you need to collect the general's head within the allotted time. This mission is basically one long puzzle chain, where you have to talk to people and they will give you clues on where to go next. Some people will need to be bribed, or you will need to run an errand for them before they'll talk to you. As this mode progresses, the places to which the player is sent become more and more hostile and hard to get to without getting killed. The end goal is to find the whereabouts of the general of the enemy, collect its head and return to headquarters. I think this is a nice mode, as it requires the player to think and use the logbook feature to take note of important coordinates on the map. It's not just a mindless seek and destroy mission where everything needs to be blown up. It provides a bit of backstory and it really feels as if you're infiltrating enemy territory as you go along. The clues given by the NPCs also become increasingly more cryptic and compel you to freely explore the world. The only downside of the Hunter mode is the replayability. Once you've played it a few times, you can cheese this mode and only pick up the minimum required items, go straight to the general, kill him and return. The missions mode consists of 10 smaller missions where specific targets need to be destroyed within a short amount of time before returning to HQ. The targets become progressively more numerous or difficult to destroy. This mode adds another layer of planning to the equation, since after completing each mission, you start the next mission in the same world and everything is exactly where you left off. For example, if your helicopter got taken down by enemy fire during the previous mission, but you managed to swim your way back to HQ, you now start off the next mission with a problem to solve. Where do I find a new vehicle to travel to my next destination? The same thing goes for wasting ammunition. The store doesn't get replenished between missions, and items you've picked up can never be picked up again. And you might find yourself struggling to find the right type of ammo as you work through the missions. So managing your resources well is key in this mode. I think this is the strongest mode of the 3 and can be replayed several times because of the innate randomness of the game. The action mode, finally, is one large mission where the player has to destroy a total of 15 targets and return to HQ within the time limit. This is my least favorite mode, as it is rather short and easy, and out of the 3 modes, invites the player the least to explore the remainder of the map. It's not helped by the fact that the majority of the targets are clustered around one area of the map, and one can easily destroy 10 of the required 15 targets within the first 20 minutes of gameplay, leaving only 5 remaining targets to be picked off. As you progress through these game modes, your soldier will receive credits, acquire medals, and get promoted to higher ranks, all the way up to Colonel. There's no special ending when you completed all 12 missions. You're just greeted with a static picture, and you can gleefully look back at your character's medals. If you haven't already figured it out by now, I have a certain fondness for this game. In 1991, this game gave me a level of immersion I'd never experienced before. The map just seems endless at first, and it makes you want to explore every corner of every island. And remember, there are 3 unique maps in this game. Not only does the game allow you to explore, it rewards the player for exploring and wandering around, as it will lead you to discovering items and vehicles that can help you complete the missions. And I think that's the hallmark of a well-designed open-world game. The missions give you a goal to achieve and a purpose, but how you complete the missions is entirely up to you. Even with a walkthrough, there is no fixed script on how to complete this game, and each playthrough you'll always find yourself having to improvise. The world can feel rather bare at times, and I'm sure this is done by design due to the technical limitations and the amount of objects that can be drawn on the humble Amiga. However, it's populated enough to feel interesting and alive. The soundscape really helps you feel engrossed into this game, and little touches like having a day and night cycle and animals enhance it even further. What sets it apart the most, though, is how you interact with your environment, and also how the environment interacts with itself. Usually with games from this era, the interactions are limited to just the things the developer intended and planned out beforehand. With Hunter, this is definitely not the case, and here's a few examples that demonstrate this. In one of the missions, we are tasked to destroy a power plant that is surrounded by plenty of ground guns and control towers. Trying to reach this by helicopter and flying low to fire missiles at it is a dangerous operation, and you can easily get taken down. However, if you position your helicopter carefully and at the right altitude, you can trick the enemy into firing their missiles into their own power plant. And then you can simply wait it out until the building gets destroyed, while barely having to fire any missiles of our own. Another interesting example is when using landmines. Landmines can be placed on the ground to trick enemy soldiers or vehicles into running into them, and this will inflict damage to them. If you walk into your own mine, it will also damage your character. But the explosion that occurs as a result of setting off the landmine can also damage neighboring objects. Here I'm out of usable ammo to directly fire at this building, but if I place a landmine next to it and run into it myself, not only will it decrease my life meter, but it will also deliver the final blow to this building. And since I had enough health, I survive and can complete the mission alive. It's details like this that make it feel like you're playing a proper military simulation. Now I could easily fill another hour talking about this game, and there are many quirks I haven't even touched on. And it's not a game without its flaws either. But that's not what this video is about. It's about a hack I made. If you're like me and you've completed this game literally dozens and dozens of times, it does make you wish that there would be more content for this game. despite its open world nature and replayability. And this is what led me to the idea of making a randomizer for Hunter. Randomizers are commonplace in the gaming community. There's Pokemon randomizers, Legend of Zelda randomizers, combined Metroid Zelda randomizers, you name it. The appeal of randomizers is that you can take the engine of an existing game and repurpose it to create new worlds, new stories, and new missions. And it almost feels as if you're discovering the game for the first time again. For the Hunter randomizer, I decided to focus on the mission objectives that the player is given at the start of every mission. These objectives are always the same on every playthrough, and giving the player a random set of objects to collect or destroy would already add a fair degree of randomness, even if the maps and the locations of the objects always stay the same. To make this happen, we first need to figure out where the game stores the mission objectives into memory. I'm using an Amiga 500 with the ACA 500 Plus expansion, and this has the option of enabling action replay. When pressing the freeze button on the ACA 500 Plus, the action replay kicks in and takes over the machine while the game is still in memory, and this allows us to inspect the memory, place breakpoints, and disassemble the code. After some tinkering around, I found out that all the mission objectives are stored in memory starting at address 9072. I'm not going to go into detail now on how I found this, since that would take us too long, but I might make another video about the techniques I used another time. Each mission takes up 16 bytes of memory, and there are 12 missions in total. The first byte of every mission represents the mission number and the game mode. The game mode can either be Hunter, Missions, or Action. You can see the single Hunter mission at the beginning, followed by the 10 missions of the Missions mode, followed by the large Action mission at the end. The next byte represents the Great Medal the player receives upon completing the mission. I never quite figured out what the next two bytes mean. The first byte seems to correlate with the game mode, but changing it doesn't seem to do anything. But it's not really relevant for this randomizer. These two bytes represent the day and time by which the mission should be completed. And then we have the amount of credits that the player receives upon completing the mission. Now this is in hexadecimal, but if you convert it to decimal, you will see that these are nice round numbers in decimal. And then there's the mission objectives, which is what I'm mainly interested in for this hack. There are up to 4 entries, and each entry is 2 bytes. If there are less than 4 entries, the remaining entries are padded with zeros. Each entry contains the object count, which is the amount of objects that either needs to be destroyed or collected, and the object type, which represents which kind of object needs to be destroyed or collected. If we look at the first mission of the Missions mode, for example, we see there's only 1 entry, the object count is 1, and the object type is 8E, and this corresponds to 1 fuel dump that needs to be destroyed. If we look at the mission of the Action mode, we see 4 entries, and the object counts are 6, 4, 4, and 1, and we see various object types. And this corresponds to the 6 fuel dumps, 4 radar units, 4 enemy forts, and 1 enemy HQ that needs to be destroyed in this mission. The Hunter mode is an interesting one, because the object count is 8-1, and this is because we don't need to destroy anything, instead we need to collect the general's head. So, if the most significant bit of the count is set, it means that whatever object type that is next to it needs to be collected instead of being destroyed. Now with this knowledge, we can already tweak the mission objectives by hand by simply changing the memory values from the action replay. So here I'm gonna change the count from 1 to 3, and I'm also going to add 1 extra objective, which is 1 times object 8F, whatever that will be. Okay, and then we simply exit the action replay and see what happens. So we're gonna start a new game here with the missions mode, and as always it's gonna ask for a name for my soldier. And there you go, we have 3 fuel dumps and 1 wind turbine that needs to be destroyed. Now what's cool is if you continue playing this mission and collect the logbook, you'll see that it actually fills out the logbook based on the new objectives. And these are locations that actually have the object that is listed there. Pretty neat. Now I don't want to be changing these values manually using the action replay as I just did. I want to write a piece of code that somehow generates a new table of mission objectives when the game starts off. Before we can go ahead and do that, there are a few things we need to figure out first. You see, we can't just put any sequence of numbers here. We need to know how many objects there are and how many instances of each object type are present in the world. If we don't take this into account, we might end up with missions that are impossible to complete. Like here in this example, it's asking us to destroy 8 radar units, but there is only 1 to be found on the map, and we're going to be stuck. To get an idea of the amount of object types and what they actually are, we can inspect the memory starting at B917. These contain the textual descriptions of all the object types separated by asterisks. So it starts with object type 0, followed by object type 1, and it continues until address BF6C before it shows other text resources that are used in the game. We don't strictly need these descriptions for the randomizer, but it makes things easier to understand if we know which object type is which. And it's also useful to know that there are 174 object types. It's immediately apparent that this list not only contains the buildings and structures you usually have to destroy, but also all the items you can pick up, vehicles, projectiles that can be fired, furniture, and so on. How do we know how many objects there are of each type? The objects that are placed on the terrain at the start of the mission are stored in memory starting at address 59ACA. This is a large table with 2048 entries, and each entry is 16 bytes. The first 2 bytes represent the object type. I don't know what most of the remaining bytes mean, except that these 2 bytes represent the X coordinate and these 2 bytes represent the Y coordinate. All we care about is how many objects of each type exist in the world, and for that the first 2 bytes are all we need, and we can just count how many times a certain type occurs in the entire table. Now if you remember, in the mission objectives table, the object type was stored in a single byte. But in this object list, there are 2 bytes for the object types. So what's going on with that? The game groups the object types into categories. The first object type of each category is stored in a table starting at address 81BA. Group 0 is not used, and so it's an empty group. Then group 1 starts at object type 0, group 2 starts at object type 14, and so on until object type AE, which is 174 in decimal. The categories have names, and these are stored in memory starting at address C1 to D. And again, this information is not necessary for the randomizer, but useful. So let's say we have object type 8E, which is a fuel dump. Using this table, we can determine that it's in category 9, which contains all structures. This category starts at object type 8C, so this would be the 3rd object type inside this category. If we search for the pattern 0309 inside the object list, we indeed find 3 fuel dumps. So with this method, we can find the maximum number of objects we could possibly find in the world for each object type. It doesn't stop there, because even if we limit the randomizer to the object that exists in the world, it could still come up with mission objectives that are impossible to complete. And this is because certain object types aren't even destroyable to begin with. For example, you wouldn't be able to destroy certain items that are meant to be collected, like master keys or floppy disks. And there are also objects that could be destroyed, but don't make much sense to destroy, like ammunition and other basic items like the map, the clock and the logbook. Then there's one final caveat, which has to do with the amount of credits you receive when destroying an object. Usually destroying a building or structure will give you a positive amount of credits, but there are items for which you are penalized and subtract from your credits if you destroy them. This happens when you destroy hospitals, churches, or kill animals. If the game were to require me to destroy a church, it will cost me 800 credits. This poses a problem, because if I return to HQ with a negative amount of credits, I'm classed as a traitor and will be arrested, and the game ends there. So in summary, we want to exclude objects that are not destroyable, are meant to be picked up, or give you negative credits when you destroy them. To make this possible, we need to know the properties of each object type. The game keeps a table starting at address D45E, and each entry is 52 bytes. This table is ordered by object type, so these will be the properties of a truck, these will be the properties of a car, and so on. These 2 bytes at offset 08 determine whether or not an object can be destroyed or not. If it equals 60, it can be destroyed, and all other values mean it can be destroyed. Here's the part of the code that handles damage, and you can see it skips part of the code if it sees the value 60. Hence, we should only be looking at object types that have 60 here. These 2 bytes at offset 0A represent the hit points of an object. The hit points denote the amount of damage an object can take before it gets destroyed. So for a truck, it's the value 14, which is 20 in decimal. But certain object types have 0 hit points from the get-go, and these are all the items that can be picked up simply by walking into them. We want to exclude these objects from being picked by the randomizer when choosing the mission objectives. These 2 bytes at offset 32 represent the amount of credits the player receives when destroying an object of this type. It's in 2 complements representation, so if it starts with an F, it means it's a negative number. A truck happens to have a positive credit bonus, but a hospital gives you minus 990 credits. We want to exclude objects with a negative credit value too. Armed with this knowledge, we can start putting it all together and write a program that generates random mission objectives that can actually be completed. I want to point out at this point that the randomizer currently only randomizes the 10 missions of the missions mode, and here's why. In the hunter mode, the player needs to collect the general's head. I could make the player collect any random object that can be found on the map, but that seems a bit lame. Instead, it would make more sense for the hunter mode to randomize the locations of the people you need to talk to and the items you need to collect to get to the general. However, I need to do a bit more research before I can implement that. The action mode is just one mission where many targets need to be destroyed, and I already mentioned earlier that it is quite short and not as engaging as the other modes. It would definitely benefit from being randomized, but I don't want to spend time on it now. The 10 missions of the missions mode make up the bulk of the gameplay, so I'm going to focus on that. What I'm going to do first is save all the relevant tables to a blank floppy disk, so that I can include them in the assembler when writing the program. First, I'm going to write the descriptions of all the object types to a file named item names. Then I'm going to write the table that contains the start of each object type category to a file named item groups. The object list that contains all the objects that are scattered around the map gets written to a file named missions items. It's important to do this when you're on the first mission briefing of the missions mode, so that we export the correct map. And finally, we write all the properties of all the various object types to a file named object types. Now we can go to work, boot into Workbench and fire up ASM-One. What I'm going to do first is write a program that consolidates all the tables we've just dumped to disk into a table that contains just the information we need for the randomizer. Here I'm including the item names, item groups, missions items and object types as binary files. And I'm also declaring the appropriate amount of space for the two output tables. The first output table will be filled while executing the program and is mostly generated for debugging purposes. It will contain all the essential properties for each object type in a human-readable format. This will allow me to inspect the table after running the code so that I can check whether it's fetching the correct values from the various input tables. The second output table will be filled with the maximum amount of objects the randomizer can pick for each object type. This is the table I will eventually use in the randomizer itself and will allow me to efficiently generate random missions that are valid. At the start of the program, we will load the base addresses of the various tables into address registers, and we will then loop over all the object types. For each object type, we will print out the description, the global object ID as it appears in the mission objectives, and also the object ID and group ID as it appears in the object list. We will then search through the entire object list and count the number of occurrences of this object type, and also print that out. The number of occurrences already gives us an upper bound for the randomizer, but we need to do a few additional checks that may set the upper bound to 0. We look up the destroyable property in the object types table and print it out. If it's not equal to 60, we set the count for this object type back to 0. Similarly, we check whether the hit points are equal to 0 and whether the amount of credits is negative. If so, we set the count for this object type back to 0. If we run this program, we can now look at the first output table in memory, and this gives us a human-readable overview of all object types and their main properties. This column is the description of the object type. Then we have the global object ID followed by object ID and group ID. This is the number of occurrences of the object type in the object list. And then come the destroyable property, the hit points, and the credits. Last but not least, there is the maximum amount that can be picked by the randomizer, and this is based on the previous 4 columns. For most object types, the maximum amount that can be chosen by the randomizer is equal to the number of occurrences in the world. But if any of the criteria that we've mentioned are not fulfilled, the maximum is set back to 0. So that the randomizer never chooses an object of this type. The randomizer will never ask you to destroy an ambulance, because it gives you negative credits, despite there being one ambulance. Similarly, a tripwire can't be chosen by the randomizer either, because it can be destroyed by firing ammo at it. The maximum counts for each object type are also written to memory as binary in a second table. We will write this table to a binary file so that we can include just that in the actual randomizer itself. The randomizer is its own separate program. From here I include the maximum item counts, and I will need a routine that generates random numbers for me. This random number generator is based on a 16-bit linear feedback shift register. At the start of the routine that generates the mission objectives, we load the base address of the item counts table in an address register, and also set up some loop variables to go through the 10 missions. To initialize the random number generator, we use the current beam position as the seed, and this should give us enough variety across playthroughs. First, we generate a random number for the object type. The object types go up to AE, so we keep generating a random byte until it gives us a value within the range. Then we check if there is at least one instance of this object type by looking up the maximum count in the table. If it's 0, we will retry with another object type. Next, we need to check if the object type was already chosen in one of the previous missions. This is important because in the missions mode, each mission starts where the previous mission left off. So if we would have to destroy all prisons in an earlier mission, we can't destroy any prisons anymore in a later mission. If the object type was already chosen before, we simply retry with another random object type. If it wasn't used before at this point, we can already fill out the object type in the mission objectives. Now we need to generate a random object count. We generate a random value between 1 and 4 and then compare it with the maximum object count from the table. If it is higher, then we retry with another random value until we find one that lies within the maximum object count for this type. This object count can then be copied to the mission objectives. The remaining 3 objectives are padded with zeros. This is done on purpose to keep the missions short enough, but also to keep the implementation simple. This whole process will repeat itself 10 times. We can verify the workings of the randomizer using this test routine that writes the objectives to an empty block of memory. And indeed, we can see that it generated 10 entries with an object count between 1 and 4 and an object type. But if we run this multiple times, we get a different result each time, which is exactly what we wanted to achieve. But there's still one missing part of the puzzle. Now we're doing this from the assembler, but we need to find a way to execute this code somehow when the game is in memory. My preferred way of playing Hunter is using the original game disk. For me, it's the simplest and fastest way to play it, as I don't have to download or install anything, and the game loads fairly fast. On an expanded Amiga, the game will also load everything into memory at once, and there are no more loading times once the game is booted up. I came up with the idea of having a patch disk that you would boot from first when the Amiga starts up. The patch disk would load and install a patch in memory, and then ask for the original game disk. You then take out the patch disk and insert the Hunter game disk. The system would then continue booting from the Hunter game disk, but at some point the patch would kick into action and apply the necessary changes to the game data in memory. I thought this would be an elegant way to modify the game data, as it works with the original game and the game disk itself doesn't need to be modified or written to at all. All the modifications happen in memory, and you just need an additional blank disk on which you install the randomizer. So that's what I ended up doing. But I'm not going to go through the entire code of this boot track for the patch disk, because that could easily be a whole separate video on its own. Instead, I'm just going to explain the principles behind it. Since the game is designed for half a megabyte of memory, everything is going to happen in the first 512K of chip RAM. When inserting the patch disk from the Amiga boot screen, the operating system will load the boot block of the patch disk into memory and start executing it. The boot block of the patch disk will first load the remainder of the boot track at address 70,000. This is the part that contains the randomizer. The code will then wait until the Hunter game disk is inserted. Once the game disk is inserted, its boot block will be loaded into memory as well, but it won't be executed yet. What the original boot block of the Hunter disk will normally do is load the remainder of the boot track, load the main executable of the game, and jump into the game. From then on, the main executable will take over and continue loading the title screen, the game assets, and start the game. But the boot block of the patch disk is currently still in control of the machine, and it will replace the jump into main with a jump into the randomizer. The boot block of the patch disk has now finished doing its job, and it will jump into the Hunter boot block that was just modified. The boot block of the patch disk is now not required anymore, and it will be overwritten by game data later on. The Hunter boot block will start off with its usual procedure and copy itself and the remainder of the boot track to higher memory and continue executing from there. It will load the main executable into memory at address 800 through address 12,000. When it's finished loading the main executable, it would normally jump into the main routine of the game, but because of the modification we applied earlier, it will jump into the randomizer instead. The randomizer then takes control and will patch the mission objectives. The mission objectives are part of the main executable and located at address 9072. The randomizer will replace the original values with randomly generated ones using the routine that we've discussed before. And then the randomizer has done its job and can jump into the main executable. The game will then start up with the randomized missions, and the randomizer is not necessary anymore and at some point will be overwritten with game data. If you want to play a new set of randomized missions, you simply reboot from the patch disk and then the Hunter disk. I will admit that this is a slightly simplified explanation, and there is a bit more to it than that. And it all has to do with the fact that the Hunter boot sequence uses a lot of techniques that prevent it from being tampered with, like encryption, self-modifying code, and checksums that make the game crash when you try to modify any of its code. But instead of going into such detail, let's try and do our first playthrough with the randomizer. I'm going to write the boot track of the patch disk to a blank floppy disk from the assembler, and also make ASM-One recalculate the checksum of the boot block. Now we'll reboot the Amiga, and on the workbench boot screen, we'll insert the patch disk. It will load for a second or two, and then prompt me to insert the Hunter game disk. We press the mouse button, and it should now start the game as normally. It's around this point here, where it goes from the rainbow effect to the title screen, that the randomizer patches the mission objectives, but you don't notice it. Alright, and now comes the moment of truth. We'll start a new game, select missions, enter our name, and there you have it. The first mission requires us to destroy 2 guard towers. And if you remember, in the original game, the first mission of the missions mode is to destroy a fuel dump. So we'll start off the way we usually do. We collect the basic items like the logbook and the map. Here we have the 2 guard towers on the map. So we'll just use the helicopter to travel to the first one. Now this was one of those where I could just fly over it and drop a bomb. And I think I got kind of lucky and killed it in my first shot. And then for the second one, I used the approach where I landed in a safe spot nearby, and then I could just fire my bazooka at it and return to HQ. Okay, so that... oh. Yeah, so that didn't go quite as planned. Just as I was about to land near HQ, I crashed my helicopter, but luckily I actually saved right before returning to HQ, so I could just reload the previous save state and continue from there. So no accidents this time. So let's see what the second mission has in store for us. And we have to destroy 1 car. And this is quite an unusual one. The original missions of the game don't really require you to destroy any vehicles. But yeah, that was a nice and easy one actually. Then on to mission 3. Yeah, obviously we got the Grade 1 medal as per usual. Okay, 4 tracer guns. Now this is a bit more like it. As usual, the logbook will tell me where to go, and it's automatically filled with positions of the 4 tracer guns. Now these are guns that shoot at the air, so I'm gonna switch to the boat so that we can get there safely and then cover the remaining distance by simply walking on the terrain. So this is the first one, and I can just fire at it straight from the boat. Then the next one is a bit further up. I can just use my pistol to fire at it. And using the aerial observation unit, I actually found that there was a third one on this island. This is not the one in the logbook, but the way the game works, you can just destroy any object of the required type, even if it's not the one that is in the logbook. So we just took out the fourth one, we returned to HQ, and we're ready for mission 4. Now you probably got the idea by now. So the next mission is asking me to destroy a hovercraft. Well, that's simple enough. We can just fly there by helicopter and drop a bomb and then return. And then on to mission 5, which asks me to destroy a surface-to-air missile launcher. Okay, well that's also easy enough. This will award us the Grade 2 medal and promote us to Corporal. Then the next one is to destroy a rocket launcher. Again, not too difficult. Although, on returning to HQ I actually ran into a few issues. The helicopter I used to go to the target was occupied by an enemy soldier, so I had to go back to HQ using a windsurfer. And yeah, it got a little bit precarious, got chased down by other rocket launchers. Then I had to move to a jeep. Then I found a helicopter, and that allowed me to return to HQ finally. That's the end of mission 6. As is often the case, the travel to and from the goal is the most difficult part. Next up, we need to destroy a control tower. Here I could just land quite nearby and fire my bazooka at it, and it only required one shot. So that was actually quite an easy mission. We got the medal and promoted to sergeant, and then on to mission 8. We must destroy one garage. This garage that's in the logbook is located in a terrible position on the map. Here I'm trying to fly low and in the meantime dodge the missiles fired by the guard towers. But finally I was able to hit the final blow, and what I actually didn't realize is that I accidentally destroyed a garage a bit earlier. But anyway, let's return to HQ and get on to the next mission. We must destroy 4 helicopters. Now this is an interesting one, because I use helicopters quite a lot to travel around the map, so now I'm using my helicopter to travel to other helicopters so I can destroy them. That was the second one out of the way, and this is the third one. Now I thought for the last helicopter I have to destroy I would try something a little bit different, so I flew back to HQ and I deliberately crashed my helicopter in the terrain right near the headquarters. And I then checked the objectives, and it actually registered this as mission complete. So I could just enter the headquarters, and there you go. We completed the mission, we got the medal, and promoted to lieutenant. Mission 10 then, which is the final mission, we have to destroy 2 shark signs. This is more reminiscent of the missions that are originally in the game. The first sign I could just destroy from the boat using the built-in missiles. And the second one I took down with a grenade. Yeah, you need to stand a bit further away for that. And then we can return to HQ. And that's it. We've done the final mission, we got the medal. And that's our first playthrough of the randomized missions mode. Now if we wanted to, we could now also complete the other 2 modes. Those are still the original game modes. So you have the hunter mode and the action mode. I'm not going to show that here. What I'm going to show you instead, however, is what happens if you would reboot again and follow the same process. And you can see every single time it will start us off with a new series of random missions, and you can keep doing this again and again and again and again. Alright, and that wraps up that project. Now I'm here in my spare bedroom where I got my Amiga set up on my ironing board. This is where I do most of my hacking actually, and yeah, I don't have a lot of desk space, so I have to make do with what I have. But yeah, if you made it until this part of the video, thanks for watching. Turned out to be quite a long video, and as I said, there's actually a lot of stuff I haven't even covered yet, but anyway. Now if you want to try out the randomizer for yourself, there is a link in the description that allows you to download an ADF file. Now I'm going to assume that you know how to transfer an ADF file to floppy, or know how to find out how to do that. But this is the randomizer boot disk, so this is the disk you insert before the Hunter game disk. So you just write it to a blank floppy. I will say though that this randomizer, this version, only works with the original game. It doesn't work with cracked versions or with WHD load installs, so you need the original Hunter game disk. But the ADF file you need to write to a separate blank floppy disk. You should never write to the 100 game disk, so make sure you keep the write protection notch open all time. You should never have to modify the 100 game disk. That way you won't lose any data. I also want to point out that there are multiple versions of this game, and the one I have is the English version, and I know of at least a French and a German version, and those might have slightly different memory layouts. So I haven't tested it with those versions. So if you try it yourself with one of these other versions that are non-English versions, just keep it in mind that the game may crash. If it does crash, it's probably a good idea to not try it again. That's probably a sign that my version of the randomizer is not compatible with your version of the game, and you should just stop using it. One thing I've noticed while I was hacking this game is that while the game is running, there is also all kinds of tampering detection going on, and the game can sometimes detect that some of its code has been tampered with or some of its game data has been tampered with, and then it will start to behave a bit strangely. Sometimes it will even ask you to insert the Hunter game disk out of the blue, and then it will also ask you to remove the write protection of the game disk and then insert it. Now, if this occurs, please do not insert the Hunter game disk without any write protection. I'm pretty sure that this is something the developers put in to punish people who try to hack the game. So if it does happen, just stop using the hack. If you use the randomizer with the correct version of the game, the version it was meant for, it should not happen. I've played this game with the randomizer for many hours now, and it doesn't happen anymore. But if it happens to you, just stop using the randomizer, and definitely do not insert the Hunter game disk without any write protection. Don't do it. If you do manage to install the randomizer and it was successful, I'll be happy to hear what your thoughts are and what your experience was. Let me know in the comments. But until next time, take care, and maybe I'll see you in a more hacking video soon.